This week in Pure Reinvention.
Of the experiences that I've really enjoyed is making sure that I'm paying attention to what other people are saying and then trying to figure out a way to respond to those opportunities.
Episode 81, Tom Woiwode, Director, Greenways Initiative, the Community Foundation.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Welcome to this episode of Pure Reinvention, where we create space for the unexpected by inspiring a reinvention lifestyle. I'm going to tell you, Misty, the whole concept that Tom brought to us was very intriguing.
He has a great way of making a very complicated and advanced decision-making process simple. He simplified it for us.
I believe that that's one of the real keys for any leadership is being able to take a very complex set of understandings and actually reduce it and distill it down to a very simple set of concepts that most people would be able to then follow the logic flow. And Tom did that very well. Yeah,
and the concept we're talking about for our listeners is making the Dequindre Cut a reality in Detroit, which is now a really popular pedestrian and bike walkway pathway. So it's a great story. We have a lot to learn from Tom, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
This week's episode is sponsored by MB Strategies. MB Strategies focuses on your success and provides you with sustainable results by identifying opportunities, guiding you through implementation, and navigating you to greater results. Contact MB Strategies today at mbstrategiesllc.com to start your reinvention journey.
So, Tom, we always ask our podcast guests these same three questions. Of the 5 steps in the reinvention process, which of those do you most closely associate yourself with?
That's an interesting question because the components of what I do personally involve actually all 5 of those. But if I had to choose one, I would choose disrupt, largely because a lot of what we're doing and a lot of what we have focused on over the years has been non-traditional, I guess you might say. It's been, we've looked for opportunities in ways that had not been pursued previously in Detroit, in Southeast Michigan, for that matter, in many places in the country.
Tom, what is your superpower?
Rest assured, I have none. The one thing that I try to focus most of my attention on is bringing resources and people together, spending time ensuring that the right people are at the table, having the right kind of conversation, and able to come up with the right solution that will benefit all.
You are a connector. And then, Tom, all of us in this leadership role find there are times when we are uncomfortable. Can you describe for us a time in the most recent past when you found yourself in an uncomfortable situation?
Actually, I spend a great deal of my professional life in that arena because a lot of the things that I do are a little bit out of the ordinary. Perhaps the most relevant to this conversation, perhaps the most appropriate conversation would be about in dealing with the property owner for a particular parcel of land that was the extension of the Dequindre Cut. At several points in time during the conversation, there was some real question about whether or not we would ever be able to pull this particular project off. It had there were some significant hurdles, and yet we knew we needed it. We knew we needed that parcel of land to complete the connections.
And what's interesting is while this particular asset was integral to the success of the project, you have to go on and continue to kind of behave as though it is going to fall into place, even at the time you're not really sure.
Well, that gets actually back to the 5 components that you're talking about. You talk about connecting, you talk about simplifying, moving things forward. A lot of the components, of the project were to make sure that the various components were being done in a timely manner and positioned us to make the next step along the way.
Tom, you have been doing some great work in the city of Detroit. Would you give us some background on what exactly your work has been in the city?
The Community Foundation, I work for the Community Foundation, and the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, which serves the 7 counties that surround and include Detroit, of course, rolled out the Greenways Initiative in 2001. And as part of the Greenways Initiative, we funded some of the design, planning, and construction of some of the non-motorized transportation corridors throughout the region, throughout our service area. And some of the more significant ones are some of those projects that you'll see in Detroit, like the Riverfront and the Dequindre Cut.
So, Tom, you had mentioned that one of the spaces that you found yourself in professionally for most of your career is working in kind of the non-traditional solutions. Can you describe for us how important it is as leaders that we learn how to be somewhat non-traditional in our solutions?
I think for me, it's been very important that I listen to others and that I pay attention to what they're saying and that I take advantage of and benefit from those instructions. And so in many cases, the initial ideas, the initial approaches, the approaches that we thought we knew because they were the approaches that we used in previous experiences are not the way that you'll be able to address some of the challenges that we were facing. And so part of the experiences that I've really enjoyed is making sure that I'm paying attention to what other people are saying and then trying to figure out a way to respond to those opportunities. And that often means that you're talking about issues in very different ways than certainly I had personally experienced in the past.
So let's use, in a practical sense, examples of how you've been able to do that with your work with the Detroit Riverfront and the Dequindre Cut.
Okay.
Walk us through kind of briefly the history and how you were able to repurpose, reinvent space to the benefit, to the significant benefit of a community.
Let me stress that there are a lot of people who were involved, a lot of people who had a variety of different skills, and we had to make sure that all of those skills and all of those contributions both meshed and were appropriately honored. So having said that, as I think many people perhaps listening to this know, the idea of the riverfront rolled out, the idea of the riverfront as it's currently formed, rolled out in 2002. And that meant that we had the opportunity to redefine what could be done along the riverfront, rebuild the public spaces, create the opportunities for public access, and a great many people were involved in that. As we thought about the opportunity that the riverfront presented, it was abundantly clear to us that, and by us again, I mean a whole panoply of people who were involved. It was abundantly clear that in order for the riverfront to realize its full potential, it needed to be connected to something, to other community assets, and in addition to that, it needed to be connected to the neighborhoods. You needed to find ways to get the community to the riverfront. And so we started looking around for one of the assets, one of the most treasured assets in the city, one of the assets that was relatively close to the riverfront and that spoke to that connection, both the asset connection and the neighborhood connection. The one that leaped immediately off the page was the Eastern Market. The Eastern Market is approximately 2 miles or so north of the riverfront. In order to go from the Eastern Market to the riverfront before the Dequindre Cut, you would end up going through a number of neighborhoods. And we thought this would be a really incredible complement to the riverfront. So part of the conversation was, how do you get there? What do you do next? And there was a rail corridor that had been actively used through the late 70s, had been abandoned for approximately 25 years, but just waiting to be claimed. And so we tried to figure out how to make sure that that rail corridor could, in fact, serve both purposes, connect both to the Eastern Market and the riverfront, and connect to the neighborhoods, make sure that the public had access to it as well.
So then there's one step is the vision that we're going to try to connect the Eastern Market to the river. We're going to try to connect the population to the river, which is step one. But how about from a leadership standpoint, what happens when we move into implementation? How does implementation work after we have this grand vision?
Well, the Dequindre Cut actually was a two-part project. The section south of Gratiot and south, was already owned by the city. There was a reason for that. It presented the opportunity to move on that one a little bit quicker. The section from Gratiot north to Mac was not owned by the city, and that had meant that we couldn't move immediately on that one. So part of the initial process was essentially identifying the challenges that needed to be addressed and sequencing them, figuring out what issues needed to be addressed, when they needed to be addressed, and it became a bit of choreography. If you remember the trench, if you will, it was an overgrown corridor. And so clearly, in order for it to become a public space, it had to be scalloped out and opened up. Well, that presented a couple of issues. Once you start to dig out the dirt, the walls that are the side of the cut, they had actually been held up by the trees, so the walls started to collapse. That created a problem because it went under some bridges that were actually condemned. We had to figure out what to do with the bridges because you weren't going to be able to allow pedestrian traffic under bridges that were literally falling down. And there was a sewer that had not been on anybody's maps. We had to figure out how to make sure that the water drained properly as the pedestrian uses took hold. And so each of those ended up being somewhat sequential. If this, then that. And the engineers, the designers, the planners who put the schedule of activities together were really quite masterful in figuring out how one step led to the other. That actually ended up, Mike, being really important, I think, to the public, because the initial impression of the Dequindre Cut, it was an overgrown, abandoned corridor, frankly, a very scary place. The initial impression was that it was not likely to be very favorably received by the public. But as each of those things started to happen and you started to pick those pieces off and you kept going back, and we kept going back to the public and talking to the public about how we were able to address these various issues, many of which were concerns raised by the public. I think that they started to get the vision and understand exactly what this could do for the community.
A couple of words that I heard that I really want you to speak a little bit about is something I think that all leaders have to deal with. And the first word I want you to speak to is the word persistence, because every time we turned around, we had something new that was not necessarily favorable that we had to deal with. At some point, leaders get a little tired of every problem being in the way, but is that really a problem or an opportunity?
I would view it as an opportunity. I would also say that you have to always see the prize. You always have to see the vision, see where the opportunity is going to take you. That is the golden mantle. That's what's in front of you. And so as these issues kept surfacing, and we had to find ways around them, we always knew that when this was done, there was going to be nothing like this in the country. We knew that we were working on something that was truly unique, and we wanted to make sure that the public understood that as well.
So by persistence, vision and persistence, you were able to overcome whatever barriers and obstacles presented themselves. But the other word I heard that I really think is going to be of interest to the people who are listening to this is this word called communication. We kept going back to the public. We kept talking to them about it. And slowly but surely, they started to see what we were seeing.
The public has to own these kinds of issues. They have to, in order for these to be embraced, the public it has to be theirs. And they have to appreciate its value and what it means to them. It has to be part of their lifestyle and their vision. And so when we first started talking about the Dequindre Cut, we would have these community meetings and we would slap some maps up on the wall and the designers would talk about it. There was a healthy skepticism, and I think deservedly so. And I think a lot of that was because we were talking to them. We weren't listening to them. And very quickly, it became clear that there were some issues that the communities raised. ways, probably the one that was most interesting and illustrative to us, and it actually changed some of the plans, was there were 4 bridges that were condemned over the cut. And our original plan, the plan of the engineers initially was to knock them all down. They were condemned, just take down the bridges and you'd have this open pathway. Well, if you take a look at the location of the residential units on the east and west of the cut, this being a Dequindre Cut South now we're talking about, you realize that if you took those 4 bridges out, even though they were condemned for vehicle traffic, pedestrians had been using them to go in and out of Detroit. That was their shortcut to the city. And suddenly we had eliminated that pedestrian corridor. And it was the public who really made us understand how important that was. So one of the middle bridge of those 4 bridges, I realize that doesn't translate mathematically, ended up being retained and is in fact designed for pedestrian use.
Tom, you have mentioned numerous times this magic that happens in this public-private partnership. Can you share how important it is for leaders to encourage and foster this thing that you're talking about, where you bring new ownership, public ownership, different types of ownership into the success of your project, and what that really means?
It's not uncommon when we in the philanthropic community are invited into a public-private partnership. The translation is monetary. Many of the state and federal dollars require a match, and it's quite common for the assumption to be the public-private partnership is that the philanthropic community is going to provide the match. I think that is both short-sighted and misses the point of the partnership itself. While we have done that, in fact, the Community Foundation and many of our philanthropic partners have been critically important in providing the needed resources at the appropriate time for many of the issues that the city has needed to address. The fact is that part of a critical component of that partnership is making sure that there is a conversation with the public, that it is a sincere conversation, that the community understands and values the issues that are being spoken to and spoken about, and helps find the appropriate solutions. So that means that you have to have sincere community engagement, and it really needs to be engagement with the community.
Tom, what's the number one lesson that you think the city of Detroit has learned as a result of the energy that's gone into the Dequindre Cut?
The first one is vision. Actually, I would go beyond vision. I would say dream. I don't think it's just a vision. I think it is important to give people an opportunity to dream about their future, to think about what their community, what they want their community to look like, and how it can be most transformative. And then the second part of that, and significant part of that, is finding a way to make a dream reality. So you mentioned use the word persistence. That meaning that once you have identified that future opportunity, that you train all your resources and all your community assets to making that dream a reality.
So will we see more public spaces like the Dequindre Cut, which allows greater access to the river from the neighborhoods?
Actually, yes. One of the more interesting outcomes of this whole process, the Dequindre Cut and the riverfront, has been the identification of a connection of corridors, largely sidewalk and bike paths in southwest Detroit, because the physical infrastructure is a little challenging. But once you get west and north of southwest Detroit, there's an abandoned rail corridor that kind of loops around the western side and the mid-northern side of the city. And if you connect those, the Dequindre Cut on the east, pedestrian pathways through Hamtramck on the northeast, and then this railroad corridor, you end up with a 30-mile loop around the city. It's known as the Inner Circle Greenway, and we've been working on that actually contemporaneous with the riverfront and the Dequindre Cut. We've been working on that somewhat simultaneously, and the city has been quite excited about that, particularly particularly as these other projects, the Riverfront first, Dequindre Cut South second, Dequindre Cut North third, as those have come online, I think the city has really fully realized the potential for what things like the Inner Circle Greenway could mean to the city.
Mike, I really like the story of the Dequindre Cut and what it means to Detroit, but also the greater takeaway we can have about how connecting things to other assets creates a greater whole.
I think we were very fortunate to run into Tom, and for Tom to be so willing to share the story of not only what the Dequindre Cut represents in terms of connecting things together, but Tom was very liberal in sharing how the Dequindre Cut was put together. And the fascinating story for me, or for us at the peer reinvention level, is how connections are put together. And Tom did a fabulous job of walking us through that.
Yeah, I learned a new phrase or picked up a new phrase from him. A sequence of challenges is how he put it. And I like that because that's kind of when you're problem solving, you really approach everything and you have to figure out how to arrange those challenges and tackle them to make a greater whole. And there's always moving pieces. And you guys kind of talked about that, how you've got to work on other parts of it while you're kind of unsure if it's really going to come through or not. Exactly.
In the sequence of challenges that was discussed, I think one of the core fundamentals that Tom reminded us of, and I think this was a phenomenal point, the importance of community involvement and listening to the real and understanding what the real issue was, Misty, because he brought that up as in a key component of the success of the Dequindre Cut.
That was huge with the bridges. He didn't know that those condemned bridges that cars couldn't safely travel on anymore were still a really important pedestrian pathway for some of the surrounding neighborhoods. And he absolutely would not have learned that without those public meetings they had.
One of the reasons we've made Connect step 4 in the reinvention process is because it is so difficult at times for us to really understand and to realize how to or what the connection points are. And yet, if we do a better job, Misty, of observing the behavior of customers, the behaviors of people, and listening to what those behaviors are telling us, those connection points become obvious. And like you said, those bridges were very, very important connection points for the population and getting from one side to the other.
And let's talk about the other ways the Dequindre Cut reinvented that space in Detroit. They have the former railway system that wasn't being used for years and years and years, and that established the beautiful path to get to the riverfront, and also the bridges, the trailway system. Pretty impressive to me off the top of my head.
Well, what was really cool was that the initial thought was if we could connect the Eastern Market to the river.
Right.
And could we do that? Well, the answer was yes, in 2 different segments, right? Tom talked about the 2 different segments. But what was really fascinating was once there was a connection between the Eastern Market or the population to the river, all of a sudden, other things wanted to connect as well, Misty. That all of a sudden, just what you thought might have been a terminal end at the Eastern Market, all of a sudden became a wonderful new beginning for the next phase of connection.
Yeah, and I don't know if our listeners are paying close enough attention, but now Tom alluded to this awesome 30-mile inner circle throughout Detroit that's going to be a reality very soon.
I think we really miss the opportunity that comes along when we think only in terms of what we're doing without realizing the impact of that work to other people and how they begin to own and begin to connect their own vision because of that initial work that you do. And I think to give Tom and that whole group of leaders a lot of credit by making that initial phase of the Dequindre Cut possible, it now will make next phases even more possible. And then all of a sudden you have almost like this capillary system connecting the neighborhoods down to the river. And what a phenomenal thing.
That is a really good point and a great lesson for us to take back to work and with our people that we're making connections with and see how those opportunities grow and spread out.
I think that everyone listening to this podcast could almost go back and say, okay, how does the story of the Dequindre Cut apply to our business? And how do we create this capillary system so that we start to feed all of our customers into our own rich asset, our own rich company? Remember, if you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. make it Pure Reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.